Scots is the Germanic language variety spoken in Lowland Scotland and parts of Ulster. It is sometimes called Lowland Scots to distinguish it from Scottish Gaelic, the Celtic language historically restricted to most of the Highlands, the Hebrides and Galloway after the Middle Ages. Because there are no universally accepted criteria for distinguishing languages from dialects, scholars and other interested parties often disagree about the linguistic, historical and social status of Scots. Although a number of paradigms for distinguishing between languages and dialects do exist, these often render contradictory results. Broad Scots is at one end of a bipolar linguistic continuum, with Scottish Standard English at the other. Consequently, Scots is generally regarded as one of the ancient varieties of English, yet it has its own distinct dialects. Alternatively, Scots is sometimes treated as a distinct Germanic language, in the way Norwegian is closely linked to, yet distinct from, Danish. A 2010 Scottish government study of public attitudes towards the Scots language found that 64% of respondents don't really think of Scots as a language, but it also found that the most frequent speakers are least likely to agree that it is not a language and those never speaking Scots most likely to do so. In the 2011 Scottish census, a question on Scots language ability was featured. Nomenclature: native speakers sometimes refer to their vernacular as Braid Scots or use a dialect name such as the Doric, or the Buchan Claic. The old-fashioned Scotch, an English loan, occurs occasionally, especially in Northern Ireland. The term Lowlands, a variant of the modern Scots word Lowlands, unregistered trademark N.D.Z., unregistered trademark NZ, is also used, though this is more often taken to mean the Lowlands literary form. Scots in Ireland is known in official circles as Ulster Scots or Ullans, a recent neologism merging Ulster and Lowlands. Etymology: Scots is a contraction of Scottis, the older Scots and northern version of Late Old English Scotisk, which replaced the earlier I-mutated version Scotisk. Prior to the end of the 15th century, English speech in Scotland was known as English, whereas Scottish referred to Gaelic. By the beginning of the 15th century, the English language used in Scotland had arguably become a distinct language, albeit one lacking a name which clearly distinguished it from all the other English variants and dialects spoken in Britain. From 1495 the term Scottis was increasingly used to refer to the lowland vernacular and Erse, meaning Irish, as a name for Gaelic. For example, towards the end of the 15th century, William Dunbar was using Erse to refer to Gaelic and, in the early 16th century, Gavin Douglas was using Scottis as a name for the lowland vernacular. The Gaelic of Scotland is now usually called Scottish Gaelic. History: Northumbrian Old English had been established in what is now southeastern Scotland as far as the River Forth by the 7th century, as the region was part of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria. It remained largely confined to this area until the 13th century, continuing in common use while Gaelic was the language of the Scottish court. The succeeding variety of early Northern Middle English spoken in southeastern Scotland, also known as Early Scots, began to diverge from that of Northumbria due to 12th and 13th century immigration of Scandinavian-influenced Middle English speakers from the North and Midlands of England. Later influences on the development of Scots were from Romance languages via ecclesiastical and legal Latin, Norman French and later Parisian French due to the Old Alliance as well as Dutch and Middle Low German influences due to trade and immigration from the Low Countries. Scots also includes loan words resulting from contact with Gaelic. Early medieval legal documents include a body of Gaelic legal and administrative loans. Contemporary Gaelic loans are mainly for geographical and cultural features, such as Cayley, Loch and Clan. From the 13th century Early Scots spread further into Scotland via the burghs, proto-urban institutions which were first established by King David I. The growth in prestige of Early Scots in the 14th century, and the complementary decline of French in Scotland, made Scots the prestige language of most of eastern Scotland. By the 16th century Middle Scots had established orthographic and literary norms largely independent of those developing in England. From 1610 to the 1690s during the plantation of Ulster large numbers of Scots-speaking lowlanders, some 200,000, settled there. In the core areas of Scots settlement, Scots outnumbered English settlers by 5 or 6 to 1. Modern Scots is used to describe the language after 1700, when Southern Modern English was generally adopted as the literary language, though Scots remained the vernacular. Status. Before the Treaty of Union 1707, when Scotland and England joined to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, there is ample evidence that Scots was widely held to be an independent sister language, forming a pluricentric diasystem with English. The linguist Heinz Kloss considered modern Scots a halbsprache in terms of an uitboursprache Euro-Obstandsprache Dagsprache framework, although today, in Scotland, most people's speech is somewhere on a continuum ranging from traditional Broad Scots to Scottish Standard English. Many speakers are either diglossic and or able to code switch along the continuum depending on the situation in which they find themselves. Where on this continuum English-influenced Scots becomes Scots-influenced English is difficult to determine. Because Standard English now generally has the role of a Dagsprache, disputes often arise as to whether the varieties of Scots are dialects of Scottish English or constitute a separate language in their own right. The UK government now accepts Scots as a regional language and has recognised it as such under the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. Notwithstanding the UK government a Euro unregistered trademark S and the Scottish Executive a Euro unregistered trademark S obligations under Part 2 of the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, the Scottish Executive recognises and respects Scots as a distinct language, and does not consider the use of Scots to be an indication of poor competence in English. Evidence for its existence as a separate language lies in the extensive body of Scots literature, its independent Euro of somewhat fluid Euro orthographic conventions, and in its former use as the language of the original Parliament of Scotland. Because Scotland retained distinct political, legal, and religious systems after the Union, many Scots terms passed into Scottish English. Language shift. From the mid-16th century, written Scots was increasingly influenced by the developing Standard English of southern England due to developments in royal and political interactions with England. When an English herald spoke to Mary of Guise and her councillors in 1560, at first they spoke in the Scottish tongue, but then not well understanding, they continued in her native French. King James VI, who in 1603 became King James I of England, observed in his work The Rulis and Coatlis to be observate and eschew it in Scottish prose, that for albeit Sindri has written of it in English, Cuic is licus to our language. However, with the increasing influence and availability of books printed in England, most writing in Scotland came to be done in the English fashion. After King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, the Protestant Church of Scotland adopted the 1611 authorised King James Version of the Bible and the Acts of Union 1707, which led to England joining Scotland to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, having a single Parliament of Great Britain based in London. After the Union and the shift of political power to England, the use of Scots was discouraged by many in authority and education, as was the notion of Scottishness itself. Many leading Scots of the period, such as David Hume, considered themselves Northern British rather than Scottish. They attempted to rid themselves of their Scots in a bid to establish Standard English as the official language of the newly formed Union. Nevertheless, Scots was still spoken across a wide range of domains until the end of the 17th century, illustrated for example, in the summary by Frederick Pottle, James Boswell's 20th century biographer, concerning James's view of the speech habits of his father Alexander Boswell, a judge of the Supreme Courts of Scotland. He scorned modern literature, spoke Broad Scots from the bench, and even in writing took no pains to avoid the Scotticisms which most of his colleagues were coming to regard as vulgar. Others did however scorn Scots, such as intellectuals from the Scottish Enlightenment like David Hume and Adam Smith, who went to great lengths to get rid of every Scotticism from their writings. Following such examples, many well-off Scots took to learning English through the activities of those such as Thomas Sheridan, who in 1761 gave a series of lectures on English elocution. Charging a guinea at a time, they were attended by over 300 men, and he was made a freeman of the city of Edinburgh. Following this, some of the city's intellectuals formed the Select Society for promoting the reading and speaking of the English language in Scotland. From such 18th-century activities grew Scottish Standard English. Scots remained the vernacular of many rural communities and the growing number of urban working-class Scots. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the use of Scots as a literary language was revived by several prominent Scotsmen such as Robert Burns. Such writers established a new cross-dialect literary norm. During the first half of the 20th century, knowledge of 18th and 19th century literary norms waned, and currently there is no institutionalized standard literary form. By the 1940s, the Scottish Education Department's language policy was that Scots had no value. It is not the language of educated people anywhere, and could not be described as a suitable medium of education or culture. Students reverted to Scots outside the classroom, but the reversion was not complete. What occurred, and has been occurring ever since, is a process of language attrition, whereby successive generations have adopted more and more features from Standard English. This process has accelerated rapidly since widespread access to mass media in English, and increased population mobility, became available after the Second World War. It has recently taken on the nature of wholesale language shift, sometimes also termed language change, convergence or merger. By the end of the 20th century, Scots was at an advanced stage of language death over much of Lowland Scotland. Residual features of Scots are often regarded as slang. A Scottish government study in 2010 found that 64% of respondents don't really think of Scots as a language. However, the most frequent speakers are least likely to agree that it is not a language, and those never speaking Scots most likely to do so. Language revitalization. Recently, attitudes have somewhat changed, although no education takes place through the medium of Scots. Scots may be covered superficially in English lessons, which usually entails reading some Scots literature and observing the local dialect. Much of the material used is often Standard English disguised as Scots, which has upset proponents of Standard English and proponents of Scots alike. One example of the educational establishment's approach to Scots is write a poem in Scots. Whereas guidelines for English require teaching pupils to be writing fluently and legibly with accurate spelling and punctuation. Scots can also be studied at university level. The use of Scots in the media is scant and is usually reserved for niches where local dialect is deemed acceptable, for example comedy, Burns Night, or representations of traditions and times gone by. Serious use for news, encyclopedias, documentaries, etc. rarely occurs in Scots, although the Scottish Parliament website offered some information in it. Number of speakers. It has been difficult to determine the number of speakers of Scots via census, because many respondents might interpret the question "Do you speak Scots?" in different ways. Campaigners for Scots pressed for this question to be included in the 2001 UK National Census. The results from a 1996 trial before the census, by the General Register Office for Scotland, suggested that there were around 1.5 million speakers of Scots, with 30% of Scots responding yes to the question "Can you speak the Scots language?" but only 17% responding aye to the question "Can you speak Scots?" The University of Aberdeen's Scots Lead Quorum performed its own research in 1995, cautiously suggesting that there were 2.7 million speakers, though with clarification as to why these figures required context. The GRO questions, as freely acknowledged by those who set them, were not as detailed and as systematic as the Aberdeen University ones, and only included reared speakers, not those who had learned the language. Part of the difference resulted from the central question posed by surveys: "Do you speak Scots?" In the Aberdeen University study, the question was augmented with the further clause "a Euro or a dialect of Scots such as Border etc., which resulted in greater recognition from respondents. The GRO concluded that there simply wasn't enough linguistic self-awareness amongst the Scottish populace, with people still thinking of themselves as speaking badly pronounced, grammatically inferior English rather than Scots, for an accurate census to be taken. The GRO research concluded that, a more precise estimate of genuine Scots language ability would require a more in-depth interview survey and may involve asking various questions about the language used in different situations. Such an approach would be inappropriate for a census. Thus, Although it was acknowledged that the inclusion of such a census question would undoubtedly raise the profile of Scots, no question about Scots was, in the end, included in the 2001 census. The Scottish Government's Pupils in Scotland Census 2008 found that 306 pupils spoke Scots as their main home language. A Scottish Government study in 2010 found that 85% of respondents claimed to speak Scots to varying degrees. The 2011 UK census was the first to ask residents of Scotland about Scots. A campaign called I Can was set up to help individuals answer the question. The specific wording used was, which of these can you do? Tick all that apply with options for understand, speak, read and write in 3 columns, English, Scottish Gaelic and Scots. Literature. Among the earliest Scots literature is John Barber's Brus, and Town's Chronicle and Blind Harry's The Wallace. From the 15th century, much literature based on the royal court in Edinburgh and the University of St Andrews was produced by writers such as Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, Gavin Douglas and David Lindsay. The Complaint of Scotland was an early printed work in Scots. The Aeneid is a Middle Scots translation of Virgil's Aeneid, completed by Gavin Douglas in 1513. After the 17th century, Anglicisation increased. At the time, many of the oral ballads from the borders in the northeast were written down. Writers of the period were Robert Sempill the Younger, Francis Sempill, Lady Wardlaw and Lady Grizzel Bailey. In the 18th century, writers such as Alan Ramsay, Robert Burns, James Orr, Robert Fergusson and Walter Scott continued to use Scots. Burns's Auld Lang Syne is in Scots, for example. Scott introduced vernacular dialogue to his novels. Other well-known authors like Robert Louis Stevenson, William Alexander, George MacDonald, J. M. Barrie and other members of the Kailyard school like Ian McLaren also wrote in Scots or used it in dialogue. In the Victorian era, popular Scottish newspapers regularly included articles and commentary in the vernacular, often of unprecedented proportions. In the early 20th century, a renaissance in the use of Scots occurred, its most vocal figure being Hugh MacDiarmid, whose benchmark poem A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle did much to demonstrate the power of Scots as a modern idiom. Other contemporaries were Douglas Young, John Buchan, Sidney Goodsell Smith, Robert Garrioch, Edith Ann Robertson and Robert McClellan. The revival extended to verse and other literature. In 1955, 3 Ayrshire Sandy Macmillan, an English teacher at Ayr Academy, Thomas Limond, noted town chamberlain of Ayr, and A. L. Taylor, rector of Cumnock Academy collaborated to write Bairns Angs, a collection of children's nursery rhymes and poems in Scots. The book contains a 5-page glossary of contemporary Scots words and their pronunciations. Alexander Gray's translations into Scots constitute the greater part of his work, and are the main basis for his reputation. In 1983, William Lawton Lorimer's translation of the New Testament from the original Greek was published. Highly anglicised Scots is sometimes used in contemporary fiction, for example, the Edinburgh dialect of Scots in Train Spotting by Irvine Welsh. Bit B'nai Go-Go by Matthew Fitt is a cyberpunk novel written entirely in what Warren Lead calls General Scots. Like all cyberpunk work, it contains imaginative neologisms. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam has been translated into Scots by Rab Wilson. Alexander Hutchison has translated the poetry of Catullus into Scots, and in the 1980s, Liz Loch had produced a Scots translation of Tartuffe by Molière. J.K. Annan translated poetry and fiction from German and medieval Latin into Scots. The strip cartoons Orwelly and the Brones in the Sunday Post use some Scots. Orthography. The orthography of early Scots had become more or less standardised by the middle to late 16th century. After the Union of the Crowns in 1603, the Standard English of England came to have an increasing influence on the spelling of Scots through the increasing influence and availability of books printed in England. After the Acts of Union in 1707, the emerging Scottish form of Standard English replaced Scots for most formal writing in Scotland. The 18th-century Scots revival saw the introduction of a new literary language descended from the Old Court Scots, but with an orthography that had abandoned some of the more distinctive Old Scots spellings and adopted many standard English spellings. Despite the updated spelling, however, the rhymes make it clear that a Scots pronunciation was intended. These writings also introduced what came to be known as the apologetic apostrophe, generally occurring where a consonant exists in the standard English cognate. This written Scots drew not only on the vernacular but also on the King James Bible and was also heavily influenced by the norms and conventions of Augustan English poetry. Consequently, this written Scots looked very similar to contemporary Standard English, suggesting a somewhat modified version of that, rather than a distinct speech form with a phonological system which had been developing independently for many centuries. This modern literary dialect, a Euro-Scots of the book, a Euro-unregistered trademark or Standard Scots, once again gave Scots an orthography of its own, lacking neither a Euro authority nor author a Euro. This literary language used throughout Lowland Scotland and Ulster, embodied by writers such as Alan Ramsay, Robert Fergusson, Robert Burns, Sir Walter Scott, Charles Murray, David Herbison, James Orr, James Hogg and William Laidlaw among others, is well described in the 1921 Manual of Modern Scots. Other authors developed dialect writing, preferring to represent their own speech in a more phonological manner rather than following the pan-dialect conventions of modern literary Scots, especially for the northern and insular dialects of Scots. During the 20th century, a number of proposals for spelling reform were presented. Commenting on this, John Corbett writes that devising a normative orthography for Scots has been one of the greatest linguistic hobbies of the past century. Most proposals entailed regularizing the use of established 18th and 19th century conventions, in particular the avoidance of the apologetic apostrophe which supposedly represented missing English letters. Such letters were never actually missing in Scots. For example, in the 14th century, Barbour spelt the Scots cognate of taken as tane. Because there has been no K in the word for over 700 years, representing its omission with an apostrophe seems pointless. The current spelling is usually tane. Through the 20th century, with the decline of spoken Scots and knowledge of the literary tradition, phonetic representations became more common. Sample text of modern Scots, from the New Testament in Scots Matthew, 1:18 ff, this is the story o' the birth o' Jesus Christ. His mither Mary was trusted till Joseph, but afore they wore marriott she was fun tiby we bairn be the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, honest man, had nae mind tire fond her afore the Walden was for bracken after trist hidlin ways. And see he was seen et in tie die, wan an angel o' the Lord kithed till him in a dream and said till him, a Euro o Joseph, son o David, be nain fear tie tark Mary your tristed wife until your hame. The ben she is carrierin is o the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and the name ye are tie guy him is Jesus, for he will sauve his folk free their sins a Euro. Or this happened at the word spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, behold, the virgin will bowk and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel a Euro, that is, a Euro o God we use a Euro. When he had walked free his sleep, Joseph did as the angel had bidden him, and took his trusted wife hame wi him. But he bede it no how she bore a son. And he ca Euro unregistered trademark d the ben Jesus. Grammar. Modern Scots follows the subject-a Euro verb a Euro object sentence structure as does Standard English. However, the word order he turned to the lick to he turned a light out and gies it to give it to me may be preferred. The indefinite article a may be used before both consonants and vowels. The definite article e is used before the names of seasons, days of the week, many nouns, diseases, trades and occupations, sciences and academic subjects. It is also often used in place of the indefinite article and instead of a possessive pronoun. Scots includes some irregular plurals such as iain, corfca, horse, coo kai and chisuan that do not occur in Standard English. Nouns of measure and quantity remain unchanged in the plural. The relative pronoun is that for all persons and numbers, but may be elided. Modern Scots also has a third adjective adverb this that yon yonder indicating something at some distance. The and the are the plurals of this and that respectively. The present tense of verbs adheres to the Northern subject rule whereby verbs end in s in all persons and numbers except when a single personal pronoun is next to the verb. Certain verbs are often used progressively and verbs of motion may be dropped before an adverb or adverbial phrase of motion. Many verbs have strong or irregular forms which are distinctive from Standard English. The regular past form of the weak or regular verbs is it, t or ed, according to the preceding consonant or vowel. The present participle and gerund are now usually but may still be differentiated and in Southern Scots and Northern Scots. The negative particle is na, sometimes spelled nay, for example canna, dorna, micna. Adverbs usually take the same form as the verb root or adjective especially after verbs. Hyana a real good day. She's off ufagelt. Phonology. Vowels. The vowel system of modern Scots, with the exception of Northern dialects, this vowel has generally merged with vowels 2, 4 or 8. Merges with vowels 1 and 8 in Central dialects and vowel 2 in Northern dialects. Also or before and depending on dialect. Vocalization to may occur before. Some merges with vowel 5. Vowel length is usually conditioned by the Scottish vowel length rule. Consonants, 1 spelt ng, always. 2 may be a glottal stop between vowels or word final. In Ulster dentalized pronunciations may also occur, also for. 3 in Northern dialects the clusters kn and gn may be realized as, and for example nap, ni, no, etc. For the cluster nch is usually realized for example branch, dunch, etc. 5 spelt th. In mid-northern varieties an intervocalic may be realized. Initial th and thing, think and thank, etc. may be. 6 both and may be spelt s or say. Z is seldom used for but may occur in some words as a substitute for the older a realized or. For example, Brulzi, Gabelunzi and the names Menzies, Feenzian, Sulzayan, Mackenzie etc. 7 spelt ch, also gh. Medial cht may be in Northern dialects. Lock, Nicht, Doctor, Dreieck, etc. Similar to the German Nacht. The spelling ch is realized word initially or where it follows are for example esch, mech, etc. 8 spelt and pronounced in all positions, that is rhotically. 9 w and wh, older, do not merge. Northern dialects also have 4. The cluster wr may be realized, more often, but may be in Northern dialects for example rack, rang, right, rocked, etc. See also, Bungie Creole of the Canadian Metis People of Scottish-British descent, Dictionary of the Scots Language, Doric Dialect, Glasgow Patter, Billy K., Lowlands, Languages of the United Kingdom, Modern Scots, Phonological History of Scots, Scotticism, Scottish Corpus of Texts and Speech, Scottish English, Scottish Literature, Ulster Scots, References. External links, Scots Online, the Scots Language Society, Scots Language Centre, The Linguist List, Eastern Michigan University and Wayne State University, Scots at Omniglet, Dictionary of the Scottish Language, a Europhonetic description of Scottish language and dialects, Words Without Borders, Peter Constantine, Scots at the Old and Noble Tongue, Scots in Schools, Emily S. J. Ecclebourne, The Politics of Language in Europe, Case Studies in Scots, Occitan, Moldovan, and Serbo-Euro-Croatian, Dictionaries and Linguistic Information, The Dictionary of the Scots Language, Scottish Language Dictionaries Limited. Dialect Map, SAMPA for Scots, Scottish Words, a Euro Illustrated, Abstract, Vowel Height Harmony and Blocking in Buchan Scots, Mary Pastor, University of California, Phonology Volume 21, Issue 3, Scots Language Recordings, Collections of Texts, Scots Text, a Euro Books, Poems and Texts in Scots, Scots Threep, Scottish Corpus of Texts and Speech, a Euro Multimedia Corpus of Scots and Scottish English, BBC Voices, Scots Section, a Euro. The BBC Voices project is a major though informal look at UK language and speech.